Lawrence stood in his grand study, the tall wooden walls looming around him like silent judges. He held a thin sheet of paper in his hand, reading words that shook him, yet he refused to show any real emotion. It was a farewell letter from his wife Clara. While most men might have felt fear or sadness at such a message, Lawrence let out a cruel, bitter laugh. The sound echoed through the room, bouncing off shelves filled with leather-bound books. He was about to toss the letter aside when his gaze fell on something small and plastic resting next to the envelope. He nearly missed it at first. Out of curiosity, he picked it up. He stared at it for a long moment without understanding what it was. Then, in a sudden burst of shock, he realized it was a pregnancy test. His mocking laughter died in his throat, replaced by an uneasy silence. Long before that unsettling night in his study, Lawrence Fairfield was just a boy born into a wealthy family. He grew up in a mansion that had been in his family for generations. Old portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined every hall. His father was known for his ruthless business dealings, and he taught Lawrence from an early age that money and power were all that mattered. His father was not only stern, he was also cruel. He snapped at the staff over tiny mistakes and refused to pay fair wages. His mother rarely tried to soften these outbursts. She stayed quiet, focusing on charity luncheons for high society friends. From these early lessons, Lawrence learned that people who were not like him, people of different races, different backgrounds, or lower economic status, were simply beneath him. His father's voice echoed in his mind, telling him over and over that they were not our kind. When Lawrence went to school, he rarely mixed with kids who came from different backgrounds. He stuck to a small circle of wealthy friends, and he ridiculed anyone who did not fit that mold. His teachers allowed him to get away with rude remarks. Other students avoided him because he made them feel small with his sharp tongue. He learned to find pleasure in their discomfort. Over time, this attitude hardened. By the time he inherited his father's business, Lawrence was known for his cold stare, his arrogant grin, and a mind focused on profit above all else. The circle of people around him were mostly eager to gain favor or wealth through his connections. He had no reason to question his views because they had served him well in the competitive world of business. And so he continued to climb higher, storing away money like a dragon guarding its hoard. Clara Ramirez came from a modest background. She grew up in a small town where neighbors looked after one another. Her father worked as a mechanic, her mother as a nurse. They were not rich, but they were happy. Clara was a bright child, always finding ways to solve problems. She had a flair for organizing events and managing details. After moving to the city as a young adult, she found work at an event planning company that coordinated large parties and corporate gatherings. Her talents soon set her apart. She was calm under pressure and treated everyone with kindness, whether they were wealthy clients or part-time helpers. The company assigned her to a massive party at Lawrence's mansion event, celebrating a new merger in his family business. This was the first time Clara stepped through the gates of that grand estate. She felt a flicker of awe at the towering pillars, the marble floors, and the sparkling chandeliers. But she also felt a hint of unease, sensing that behind this beauty lay a colder reality. During the setup, some of the floral arrangements arrived in the wrong color. Everyone else panicked. Clara took charge, contacting the supplier and finding a quick solution. She moved with quiet authority. Lawrence, watching from across the room, was impressed despite himself. He had seen many event managers fail under pressure. Clara, though, handled the crisis smoothly. Intrigued, Lawrence asked her to come over once the party was in full swing. He spoke in his usual clipped tone. "You did well," he said. That was high praise coming from him. Clara simply nodded. "I'm glad everything worked out." Normally, he would not have cared about the life story of someone planning his event, but something about Clara's calm manner made him ask more questions. He discovered she grew up in a completely different world than his ownless wealth, more community. It both interested and unsettled him. In the weeks following, Lawrence requested Clara's services for several more events at his mansion. Though he rarely praised anyone, he found himself oddly drawn to her competence and the way she respected everyone on her team. She treated the waiters, florists, and decorators with genuine warmth, asking about their families and their well-being. This was something he had never seen before in a person who worked under him. Clara, meanwhile, was wary of Lawrence. She had heard how he treated his staff, how he sneered at people of different races, and how his parties often ended with him mocking those less fortunate. Yet, he was always polite to her face, at least on a business level. She was also grateful for the steady work. She used the money to help her aging parents. Slowly, an odd friendship formed. After each event, Lawrence would invite her to sit for a cup of tea or a walk in the large rose garden. He asked her about her favorite foods, her town, and her culture. Often, his questions revealed his ignorancy, made awkward remarks about how he was surprised someone like her could be so organized. Clara tried to correct him without seeming confrontational. She saw a faint openness in him, a curiosity mixed with his bias. Her friends warned her not to trust him. They called him a snob, a racist, and a man who would never change. She knew he had serious flaws. She had seen the way he scolded his staff and refused to consider people as equals. But she also sensed there was a chance he could learn something new if he wanted to. After a few months, Lawrence asked Clara on a date. His invitation was blunt, almost awkward. She was taken aback but agreed to meet him on her terms, at a small family-owned restaurant in her old neighborhood. Lawrence was obviously uncomfortable in such a casual setting. The menu was filled with dishes he had never tried, and the customers were not dressed in formal attire. However, Clara explained the flavors to him, coaxing him into tasting something new. He managed to say, "It's interesting," instead of making a cruel remark. Though it was a small step, it felt like a sign he was capable of stretching beyond his narrow world. It was not long before Lawrence, impulsive and eager to make Clara his, proposed marriage. He did it without grand romance, more of a business-like approach. Yet Clara accepted. She believed, with a cautious heart, that perhaps she could inspire real change in him. She still felt uneasy, but she also cared for him in a way she had not expected. When they married, some of Lawrence's rich friends sneered behind their champagne glasses. They could not believe he had chosen someone from a different background. Clara heard whispers about her low status. However, Lawrence waved off their comments, saying he did not care. His ego was large enough that he believed he could weather any gossip. The life of the mansion was not easy for Clara. She saw how the staff tiptoed around Lawrence. The slightest error led to his yelling, or worse, his cold dismissal. She tried to defend the staff, to encourage Lawrence to be fair, but he brushed her off. He insisted that since he paid them, he had the right to treat them however he liked. Their arguments became frequent. She reminded him that real respect had to be earned, not bought. He in turn called her naive. He claimed that charity was only useful for public relations. If it did not increase his standing or profits, he saw no value in it. Clara's heart grew heavy over time. She had hoped marriage might soften Lawrence's views, but she found him as dismissive and condescending as ever. He would sometimes scoff at the way her mother spoke English, or at the traditions Clara grew up with. He acted like those things were beneath him, even though they mattered deeply to Clara. She thought back to the days before their wedding, when he showed small efforts trying new foods, asking her about her life. But that side of him was buried now. He returned to his comfort zone of wealth and status, surrounded by people who agreed with his every word just to win his favor. One night, he hosted a dinner for business partners. Clara heard them making cruel jokes about workers from foreign countries. They laughed at stereotypes, acting like these people existed only to do menial tasks. Disgusted, Clara left the table in the middle of the meal. Lawrence glared at her as she stood up. In front of everyone, he demanded to know why she was walking out. She only replied, "I will not sit and listen to this," and hurried from the room. Later, in their bedroom, the fight was fierce. He accused her of embarrassing him. She told him that bigotry was no laughing matter. He dismissed her words, claiming it was just business humor, telling her she was overreacting. That night, she lay awake, feeling more alone than ever. As weeks passed, Clara's misery grew. She tried to talk to him again and again. She tried to show him news stories, documentaries, and books about racial injustice. "Hello, wonderful friends and followers. I'm reaching out because I have a big goal in mind, hitting 1,000 subscribers. It's a milestone that will help our community grow and allow me to share more exciting content with you. Every single subscriber makes a huge difference and brings me one step closer to achieving this dream." Each time he waved her off, saying he was too busy or that he did not need to feel bad about being rich and powerful. She realized he was missing the whole point. No one asked him to feel bad for his success. They only asked him to have compassion and respect for people who were different. Around the same time, Clara began feeling sick in the mornings. At first, she thought it was stress, but after checking her calendar, she realized her cycle was late. Her hands shook as she took a pregnancy test. Staring at the positive result, her emotions clashed. She felt a spark of joy at the idea of a child, but also a deep fear. How could she raise a baby with a father who insulted people based on race or income? She watched Lawrence go about his life, shouting orders at the staff, ignoring their personal stories. She imagined their future child growing up in that environment. The thought terrified her. Would the child absorb his hateful views? Or would the child be hurt if Lawrence ever said cruel things about parts of their heritage inherited from Clara? She felt torn apart by these questions. One evening, she tried to talk to Lawrence about her fears. She hinted that she was thinking about having children, hoping to see if his attitude might shift when he considered fatherhood. He responded with a shrug, saying, "Well, if we have kids, I'll make sure they know how to handle themselves in a world run by people like us." His tone was smug, as though he believed children were simply another asset. That was the last straw for Clara. She realized she could not stay any longer. If she remained, their child would grow up in a house filled with disdain for others. Clara wanted her baby to learn kindness and respect, not hatred. So, she made a plan. She would leave the mansion before Lawrence returned from an upcoming business trip. She wrote him a farewell letter, explaining everything. She told him she had loved parts of him, the glimpses of compassion he once showed. But she could not sacrifice her well-being or the future of their child by staying in a toxic environment. She placed the letter on his desk in the study, along with the positive pregnancy test. Then, with tears in her eyes, she quietly packed her bags. She said a few soft goodbyes to the staff who had shown her kindness. She slipped out of the mansion gates, her heart aching but her resolve firm. Lawrence returned late that night, tired but satisfied from closing a profitable deal. He expected a warm welcome from Clara or at least a quick greeting. Instead, he found the house oddly quiet. The staff looked away when he asked if they had seen his wife. They only murmured that she left a letter for him. He entered his study, switched on the lamp, and spotted the envelope with his name. He picked it up, barely noticing the small plastic object next to it. As he read Clara's words, a sneer tugged at his lips. It was a farewell letter, filled with raw emotion. She wrote of her sorrow, her disappointment, and her determination to protect their unborn child. At first, Lawrence let out a mocking laugh. He assumed she was being dramatic. But then he saw the pregnancy test. He lifted it from the desk, and a cold wave of realization rolled through him. She was pregnant. She had left him and taken his unborn child with her. His sneer faded. The study grew silent. He read the letter again, this time feeling uneasy. She was gone, and she was carrying his child. For the first time in a long while, fear crept into his heart. After that night, the mansion felt lifeless. Lawrence roamed from room to room, barking orders at the staff with even more anger than usual. He told himself Clara would come crawling back once she realized how hard life was without his money. But deep down, a small voice whispered that she was gone for good. He could not sleep. When he tried, he dreamed of a child calling out to him, a child he might never meet. Some nights he roamed the halls, passing closed doors that used to be empty guest rooms. Suddenly, he wondered if they might have been a nursery one day. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. At work, he grew short-tempered and unfocused. Business partners noticed he was not himself. He brushed off their concerns, insisting everything was fine. Yet, the letter and the pregnancy test haunted him. He read Clara's words over and over, recalling how she wrote about the harm his hateful attitudes could do to their child. Though Lawrence's pride fought against it, he began to question himself. Late at night, sitting alone in his grand study, he thought about the things Clara said. He remembered the times she tried to talk to him about racism, how people were hurt by careless words. He recalled how she treated the staff as fellow human beings. Slowly, a new emotion took hold of him: regret. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself that regret was pointless, but it kept returning, making him restless. He realized that if he ever wanted a chance to see his child, he might have to change. But change was not easy. He had lived his entire life believing in his own superiority. He had mocked those who worked for him, those who came from different cultures. Now, he had to confront the idea that he was wrong. He fought the notion, blaming his upbringing, blaming society, blaming everyone but himself. Yet, in the quiet hours, he knew he was responsible for his actions. Days turned into weeks. Lawrence tried to find Clara. He had no direct way to contact her because she had changed her phone number. He called the event company where she used to work, but they said she had quit. He tried speaking to old friends of hers, but most were protective. They refused to help him. Desperate, he hired a private investigator. The man visited various addresses, asked questions, and tried to track Clara's whereabouts. Each time, the reports came back empty. It seemed Clara had vanished, determined to shield herself and the baby from his reach. Late at night, Lawrence would stare at the pregnancy test he had kept, balanced on a corner of the desk. It was a cold, plastic reminder that he was supposed to be a father. He pictured a tiny child in Clara's arms, maybe a little boy or girl who inherited her warm smile. He wondered if his own features would show up in the child's face and whether that child might learn to despise him for his cruelty. With no answers forthcoming, Lawrence felt a new kind of emptiness. Money and power, which once gave him pride, now felt hollow. He began speaking to one of his old acquaintances who had tried to address racism in a local community group. In the past, Lawrence mocked this man for wasting time on social causes. Now he reached out with trembling steps. They met for coffee in a plain cafe, far from the elegant restaurants Lawrence usually preferred. The old acquaintance listened to Lawrence's story in silence, then offered a suggestion. Therapy? He said Lawrence needed help understanding the roots of his hatred and the damage it caused. Normally, Lawrence would have scoffed, but with his life in shambles, he agreed to try. Therapy was painful. The counselor pushed him to look at his upbringing, the things he believed about race and class. She asked him to name the exact reasons he thought he was better than others. Each question felt like a dagger, but he continued attending the sessions, clinging to a faint hope that it might lead him back. Slowly, he started making changes around the mansion. He asked the staff about their lives. Many were hesitant to speak, afraid it was a trick. But some shared small details show they sent money home to family, how they were saving for college, or how they juggled multiple jobs. Lawrence listened, realizing for the first time that they were people with dreams, not just servants. He felt an odd mixture of shame and wonder. Had he really spent years ignoring the humanity right in front of him? He remembered times he had fired people on a whim, not caring if they had families to feed. Now the thought of it made him uneasy. In therapy, he talked about his father's influence and how his mother stood by, never challenging his father's cruelty. The counselor pointed out that Lawrence had a choice: he could continue the cycle or try to break it. For the sake of his unborn child, he realized he wanted to try breaking it. Nearly 6 months after Clara left, the private investigator called with a lead. It was not a sure thing, but he had heard that Clara was staying in a small town with an older relative. Excitement and fear mingled in Lawrence's chest. He worried Clara might slam the door in his face, yet he had to try. He decided to write her a letter first, to show that he was not the same man. In simple, honest words, he apologized for every cruel thing he had said. He told her about therapy, about his attempts to change how he treated the mansion staff. He admitted that he still had a long way to go, but he wanted to be a better man for their child. He mailed the letter to the address the investigator provided, praying it would reach her. Weeks passed. No response came. He tried not to lose hope. Therapy had taught him that change was a process, not a quick fix. One morning, while Lawrence was in his study, the phone rang. It was a number he did not recognize. His heart raced as he answered. A gentle voice introduced herself as one of Clara's cousins. She said Clara had received his letter. She had read every word, and while she was still wary, she wanted to give him a chance to see her before the baby was born. Lawrence nearly dropped the phone. Relief and anxiety flooded him. He managed to get the details. A small family home in a quiet town, far from the city. Clara had agreed to a brief visit, but only if he respected her boundaries. He was not to stay long or bring any chaos into her life. Though the trip took several hours by car, Lawrence set off right away. Along the ride, he replayed all the mistakes he had made, trying to prepare himself for the meeting. He was not sure how she would receive him. He only knew he had to try. Lawrence arrived on a sunny afternoon, feeling out of place in front of a modest house with a chipped picket fence. He had never stepped foot in such a neighborhood. His expensive car stood out like a sore thumb on the narrow street. Children were playing outside, neighbors hung laundry, and there was a warmth in the air he was unaccustomed to. Taking a shaky breath, he walked up to the door. Clara's cousin answered, nodding curtly. She led him into a small living room where Clara sat on a worn couch. She looked tired, her belly round with pregnancy, but there was a glow about her. Lawrence felt a lump in his throat, seeing her for the first time in so many months. Clara did not smile. Her eyes searched his face for any sign of real change. She asked how he had been, and he told her the truth, that he had been miserable, that he was trying to become someone worthy of being a father. He confessed his therapy sessions, his late-night regrets, his efforts to show respect to the staff. Still guarded, Clara said she needed time to trust him again. She was thankful he had come, but she warned him that if he showed even a hint of his old arrogance, she would shut him out permanently. He nodded, tears in his eyes, promising he would not fail her again. They talked for an hour. He learned that her extended family had been helping her prepare for the baby. She had a small room upstairs ready for the child, painted in soft pastel colors. For the first time, Lawrence felt a longing that was not about money or power. It was about being part of this new life. At last, Clara told him he could visit again if he stayed honest and respectful. Over the next few weeks, Lawrence continued therapy and visited Clara when she allowed it. He tried to earn her trust day by day, showing small acts of kindness. He helped carry groceries, fixed a broken fence post, or rather paid someone fairly to fix it, but supervised to ensure they were treated well. He also sat with her and listened to her concerns about raising a biracial child in a world that could be cruel. She spoke about times when she faced bigotry and how she refused to let her child grow up thinking that was acceptable. Lawrence felt guilt burn in his chest, recalling how he had once laughed at such worries. Now, he understood that her experiences were real, that words and attitudes could wound just as deeply as physical harm. Clara still kept him at arm's length, not letting him move in or take over her life. She wanted him to prove over time that he could be a better man. They talked about the baby's future, and he tried his best to listen rather than dismiss her fears. Each conversation brought him a new awareness of how little he had understood before. Late one evening, Lawrence was in his mansion, still planning to downsize it because it felt too empty. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was Clara's cousin, her voice tense. "Clara's in labor," she said. "If you want to be here, come now." Without thinking twice, Lawrence grabbed his coat and rushed to his car. He drove through the night, heart pounding, remembering everything he had done to reach this point. Would she even want him in the room? Or was he only there to wait outside? When he arrived at the small hospital, he found Clara's cousin in the waiting area. She led him to a room where Clara lay, breathing hard, sweat on her brow. The moment Clara saw him, she looked torn between anger and relief, but she nodded, letting him stay. It was a long labor, filled with pain and fear. Lawrence stood by her side, holding her hand when she let him. He encouraged her in a whisper, telling her she was strong, that she could do this. For the first time, he truly realized how vulnerable and human these moments were. No amount of money or power could ease her pain or speed up the birth. At last, near dawn, a piercing cry filled the room. A nurse placed a small, wriggling baby in Clara's arms. Lawrence felt his heart stop. He gazed down at the tiny face, pink and fragile, with wide, curious eyes. Tears slipped from Clara's face onto the baby's blanket. After a few minutes, Clara turned to Lawrence. She studied his face, searching for any trace of his old self. All she saw was awe and maybe fear in his features. Slowly, she held out the child for him to see. He reached out with trembling hands, gently touching the baby's soft cheek. In that moment, every prejudice, every hateful word, every mocking laugh seemed to echo back to him. He felt the full weight of what Clara had warned him about the harm that hatred could bring into the life of someone innocent. He whispered, "I'm so sorry," though he was not sure if Clara heard him over the baby's soft cries. He understood this was the start of a new journey. The old Lawrence was a man who would have laughed at suffering and taken pride in his narrow views. The man standing here now felt humbled by the little life he held in his arms. He realized there was no going back if he wanted to protect this child's future. The doctors checked Clara and the baby, both healthy. Lawrence stepped outside for a moment to let Clara rest. He leaned against a wall in the hallway, tears in his eyes. He had never cried in public before, never allowed himself to show such vulnerability, but he did not care who saw him now. When he returned to the room, Clara's cousin had stepped out, leaving them alone. Clara looked at him, still uncertain, still wary, but not entirely closed off. She let him sit next to her. He placed a gentle hand on the baby's head. "We haven't chosen a name yet," Clara said softly. He nodded, feeling grateful she included him in such an important decision. I'd like to help," he said, voice trembling, "but I want you to choose what feels right. I only ask that someday you'll trust me enough to be a real father to this child." Clara gave a slight nod. "We'll take it slow." Her eyes watered as she looked at their baby, one step at a time. Lawrence understood that forgiveness was not immediate. He had caused deep wounds that would take time to heal, but the baby's birth was a sign of new life, a chance for redemption. If he was willing to shed his old ways, to keep learning and growing, perhaps Clara might allow him to stay close. As morning light flooded through the hospital window, the three of them sat in a stillness that felt sacred. For the first time, Lawrence felt the warmth of true hope. He thought about his old mansion and how he used to believe it gave him power. Now, real power came from holding this tiny baby and promising to become a better man. Outside, the sun rose higher, illuminating a new day. Inside that hospital room, Lawrence gently cradled his child, thinking of the hard work ahead. He would continue therapy. He would treat his staff and everyone around him with respect. He would learn about Clara's culture in a genuine way, not just out of curiosity, but out of a desire to honor who she was. He would do whatever it took to make sure his child grew up in a loving environment, free from the poison of hate. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with earnest emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for letting me be here." She nodded, tired but resolute. "You have a lot to prove," she murmured. "But you're the baby's father. I won't shut you out if you keep showing me you've changed." Lawrence swallowed hard, tears returning to his eyes. "I will," he promised. "I will keep trying. For both of you." Clara leaned her head back against the pillow, closing her eyes. The baby, now calm, lay nestled in her arms. Lawrence placed a hand gently on Clara's shoulder, as if to shield both mother and child from all the harshness in the world he once embraced. In that quiet hospital room, the old Lawrence died. A new one was born who saw that true value had nothing to do with wealth or status, but everything to do with compassion and respect. And as the morning rays shone on the sleeping baby, Lawrence silently vowed to never go back to who he was before. Hello, wonderful friends and followers. I'm reaching out because I have a big goal in mind: hitting 1,000 subscribers. It's a milestone that will help our community grow and allow me to share more exciting content with you. Every single subscriber makes a huge difference and brings me one step closer to achieving this dream.